Welcome to Accelerate Science Now, where we sit down with innovators shaping policy, research, and industry to ask one big question: how do we make science move faster and work better for everyone? On today's episode, I'm joined by Dr. Erwin Gianchandani, who leads the National Science Foundation's newest directorate, Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships. We talk about why NSF is rethinking how it funds and scales science, how TIP is helping move breakthroughs out of the lab and into the world, and what it takes to build a stronger innovation ecosystem across the country. Enjoy the show. Today's guest is Dr. Erwin Gianchandani. Erwin leads the National Science Foundation's newest directorate, Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships, or TIP. It's the first new directorate at NSF in more than 30 years, and Erwin has been the driving force behind shaping its mission: accelerating critical technologies, expanding who participates in the innovation economy, and turning research into real-world impact. Before launching TIP, he spent a decade in senior roles across NSF, including as Deputy Assistant Director for Computer and Information Science and Engineering. He's helped stand up major initiatives in advanced wireless, smart communities, and national AI research. Erwin is a computer scientist and biomedical engineer by training, and one of the country's most thoughtful voices on how we build a stronger, more inclusive scientific enterprise. So, Erwin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me, Adeline, and thanks for that really kind introduction. Way too kind, but glad to be here.
Of course, well, we're glad to have you. So we always like to get started learning a bit more about your background, and wanted to hear if there was anything specific early on in your career or your studies that sparked your interest and made you want to pursue a career in science and technology.
Oh, so that's an interesting question. So yeah, actually, so when I was much younger, back in elementary school, I somehow at some point became really fascinated by the weather, just meteorology. I didn't know it was called meteorology at the time, but uh, I used to have the news on when I was at home doing a little bit of homework that we would do in elementary school. We It was broadcast era back then. We didn't have cable, we didn't have social media, and so forth. And so just four channels or however many channels there were, and so in the evening, I'd be sitting there doing homework, and the news would be on, and the weather would come on, and I would be really interested in this notion of being able to predict what the next day is going to look like, and especially when it was in the context of severe weather storms, thunderstorms, or in the wintertime, especially snow. I mean, as a kid, what kid doesn't love the snow, right? And so I mean, it gets you out of school for a few days, and so just thinking about, oh, well, you can actually use science to be able to predict what the next day's weather is going to look like, which of course has implications in terms of what you wear, but also implications in terms of for farming or agriculture or airline travel and so forth. And so I really became fascinated by weather and eventually meteorology. In fact, when I was in eighth grade, by the time I got to eighth grade, we did career day, and the career day that I did was to shadow the local TV news meteorologist at the news studio, just to kind of see how they put together the forecast for an afternoon and their evening segments and so forth. So that's, I think, what really sparked for me this interest in science and technology, and that sort of then led me to thinking about, well, how do you model the weather forecast for the next few days? Well, that got me into computer science, and then somewhere along the way, bioengineering as well. But yeah, that was sort of what I trace it back to, I suppose.
Oh, that is really fun. I bet uh, shadowing a meteorologist would be a really exciting thing to
It
do
was pretty
as
cool.
an
It
eighth
was
grader.
actually very cool. I mean, back then, watching them do the graphics in the evenings, like how they actually did the graphics at the time versus what you see on the screen, just night and day in terms of what you would expect, how big the studio was versus how big it seems on TV. Yeah, it was just a very interesting experience for
Yeah,
sure.
fun behind the scenes. So yeah, so you definitely made a bit of a curve. You're not a meteorologist now, but so and you focused on biomedical engineering in college, correct?
Yeah, so my undergraduate degree was, so kind of building from there. My undergraduate degree was in computer science. my parents and others advised me that, at the time, this was going into sort of what was the dot-com era, and the sense that, okay, having sort of a foundational degree in computing and software development could be helpful in a variety of different spectrums, whether you go into health or you go into finance or what have you. So I did that as an undergrad. I minored in biomedical engineering. I was always interested a little bit also in just sort of thinking about how the human body works and so forth. And so did that as an undergrad, and then decided to transition in grad school to uh, what eventually became my area of focus, which is computational systems biology. So, really thinking
Sure.
about ways in which we could leverage computational techniques, predictive modeling, even early days of AI in that context, as we know it today anyway, to really think about ways in which we could stitch together large data sets from experiments that are being run in the lab, to be able to model, simulate cellular systems, to be able to better understand disease mechanisms and potentially better identify therapeutic targets. And so that's sort of what my schooling took me to, I suppose. And that's where I spent most of my graduate experience, is really focusing on biomedical engineering, but this sort of intersection between computing and biology as well.
Yeah, definitely still on the same theme of really, real world impacts that you can see from science.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've just been really fortunate throughout my career to have mentors, advisors, and just work that's excited me or interested me, which is really about, as you say, what are the intersection points between different disciplines? What are ways in which sort of the science that you're pursuing is being driven by real world problems, real world scenarios, and so forth. One of the projects I worked on actually as a grad student was looking at glioblastoma, one of the deadliest forms of brain cancer, one of the deadliest forms of cancer that exists, to our knowledge today, anyway, to really try to understand, okay, based off of pathology reports and so forth, and samples, can we extract some meaningful insights? Can we do some modeling to potentially, improve the curve, if you will, in terms of survival rates in that particular disease? So yeah, I've always really been interested in, how do I bring a technical background to bear to understand some of the challenges that industry faces, or that governments face, or that people face, and how do we potentially address those challenges going forward?
Yeah, wow. What an incredibly important thing to be working on. And so after your PhD, you kind of went straight to NSF almost with the AAAS fellowship. Could you talk a bit more about that fellowship and, how it led you to NSF?
Yeah, for better or worse, I have this sort of connection to NSF that actually goes back to even when I was an undergrad. So I was an undergrad major in the engineering school, and the engineering school at the University of Virginia at the time offered the ability to be able to um, place undergraduate students over the course of a summer in a policy setting in Washington. So give them exposure to what it's like to work uh, in the government, what it's like to be able to bring that technical background again, that engineering background in that sense, to be able to help inform decision making taking place in the government environment. And so I spent a summer interning at the time at NSF, and that actually is what sort of set me on this glide path to say, okay, everybody at NSF, comes at it from a scientific, technical background. Well, what do I need to do to be able to position myself for a job like that at some point down the road? I didn't think I'd end up back at NSF, but so then when I graduated with my PhD, I was still very interested in this notion of science meets government, drives policy decisions, and so forth. And so applied for the AAAS fellowship because it was viewed at the time as being sort of the gold standard when it comes to how you get yourself as a scientist or technologist or engineer into a government job. And so was fortunate to get accepted, and ended up, interviewed at various places, ended up getting placed at NSF in the same place that I actually was working in as an intern. I used to be able to say, before NSF moved across town, I used to be able to say that I've moved from when I was an intern to now as a fellow, like two doors down from where I was working to where I'm working now. So I did this fellowship. Again, it gave me exposure to how do you start new initiatives, how do you sort of lead new initiatives to help support the research ecosystem, the research enterprise. Therein, again, also I was really focused on health information technologies. So how do you marry together NSF and NIH and potentially other funders? And how do you think about, in that case, sort of clinical settings, healthcare settings, informal settings? When we have a healthcare system that's really trying to treat patients with chronic illnesses, how do you help to be able to provide them with the data capture in a privacy preserving way, the data analytics around their electronic health records, be able to provide providers with the information that they need to make decisions, and how do you make sort of not just the patient but the patient's family be a part of that ecosystem as well in terms of the decision making. So help start an initiative around health IT that actually until recently NSF was still running, and so that sort of got me thinking, okay, well, here are ways in which you can actually, in alignment with whatever administration may be the case, right? In alignment with whatever Congress may be the case, how do you sort of position initiatives that are especially relevant for the needs of the country and the nation's competitiveness for the current and medium and long term? So, yeah, it was great fellowship, and then I went away for 2.5 years, but found myself back at NSF
You
after.
did go away. I was gonna say, then you never left.
No, no, no. I went away for 2.5 years. I ended up working at a nonprofit thinking about sort of back in the field of computing, how sort of what are some of the research directions that the field of computing could pursue in alignment with national priorities. So I did that for about 2.5 years, and then found my way back to NSF as a member of the federal workforce. Yeah. So I've been here
Cool.
now for about 13 and a half years.
Wow, 13 and a half years. I'm sure this is a really difficult question because it sounds like you're always working on something very fascinating, but do you have a favorite project that you've worked on at NSF?
Um, I don't know that I have a favorite project. I would say that I am super excited and super passionate about how do we design initiatives that are really going to position us for and position the nation for its long term competitiveness and security. And so in your really kind introduction, you talked about how we've worked on smart cities and AI institutes. We've worked on thinking about ways in which you can spur cybersecurity approaches for today and tomorrow, and so forth. So more recently, with the establishment of this new directorate, we've really thought about how do you accelerate technology to the market and how do you sort of expand that the tent of NSF, that we're not just about pushing great ideas to the market, which is something we've always done and we will continue to do, but how do you bring the market to the table to really give rise and then sort of demand or pull out solutions? So, yeah, I think all of these are things that excite me. All of these are things that I've enjoyed working on. But I'll tell you honestly, Adeline, the thing that I'm most um, the thing that keeps me up, or gets me up out of bed every morning, gets me coming into work every day, are the people that we have. Right, we have just phenomenal folks here. Some of the world's foremost experts in specific areas of science and technology, and everybody's so passionate about sort of that national competitiveness argument and how do we use the precious taxpayer dollars that we have for the best possible impact that we can get. And so I think that is something that really excites me, but I don't know that I have a favorite project. I also don't think I should say because I'm sure people will take issue with it. But no, I mean, in all seriousness, I think that I've been excited about so many things that we've had the fortune to be able to work on over the years.
Yeah, well, how lucky are we to have people working at NSF who, care so deeply and are doing this for so long, really for just America at large. It's really, really fantastic. I'd love to hear more about the new directorate or TIP. So established pretty recently, March of 2022, I believe. And I think, yeah, as we mentioned, first new directorate in 30 years. How can you talk about how that happened? How did TIP come to be?
Yeah, sure. So, I think that one of the things that I try to stress about this is that a lot of times in Washington, it's really easy to say, "Oh, this is the result of this party or that party" or something to that effect. I mean, I think that everybody would agree that as a nation, we face pretty fierce competition in terms of technology and technology advancement, particularly in areas like AI or quantum, advanced wireless or biotechnology and so forth. And so, we've obviously invested pretty heavily out of NSF and other agencies in the federal government over the years, more on the basic science side. And we see sort of a private sector that is very focused on how do we take up some of the results from that federal investment in basic science, and how do we productize it, and how do we commercialize it, and how do we get mainstream solutions out there, and so um, but I think that, and by the way, I think that you find the approach that the U.S. has taken over many years, probably 75 years since the founding of NSF back in 1950, has really been one of this symbiosis between federal government, universities, higher education, and private industry, right? And it's something that I think other countries around the world have emulated as they've seen sort of how this type of approach and this innovation enterprise, this discovery and innovation ecosystem really has yielded outputs like the MRI, or being able to think about ways we optimize organ transplants, or the Google search engine, right? And leading to this now multi-billion dollar, trillion dollar enterprise, global enterprise, and so forth. So I think that there's a lot to be said for that approach and that historic approach that we've taken. At the same time, I think that there's also a lot to be said for there continue to be sort of these gaps, or somebody called it recently, these opportunities that present
Mhm.
themselves that are still untapped or unfulfilled, right? So we do spend a lot of time and energy on the basic sciences. Industry spends a lot of time on much more of the really focused applied work leading to products and so forth. But in between, I think there's an opportunity for us to really be able to think about how do we bridge that gap, or how do we overcome or seize that opportunity, depending on how you want to talk about it, to really help accelerate some of the research outputs into the marketplace on an even faster basis, right? I mean, I just think about sort of the pace of scientific discovery and the pace of innovation, right? If you go back 10, 15 years ago and you fast forward to today, almost every field is being driven by AI, and the need for AI ready data. Almost every field is being driven by AI itself, leveraging those AI ready data sets to be able to harness new insights and new predictions, and generate new hypotheses, even that inform future experiments that we might want to run, and so forth. Every sector of our economy, as we all know, being driven in that way as well. And so, I think we found ourselves in a few years ago, and we still find ourselves today very much at this unique moment in time. And I think it's even more so today, this sort of inflection point. And that inflection point for me is, the fields are changing. The fields of discovery and innovation are changing. The way in which we're doing that discovery and innovation is changing. The pace at which we're doing that is changing. Um, and, our competitors have sort of come to understand the way in which we've traditionally done things, and they've emulated that type of an approach. And so this sort of moment in time, I think, really calls upon us to think about new ways of pursuing the scientific and technological enterprise for our country. And I think it also calls upon us to be able to understand. So, as I was describing earlier, it's typically called the valley of death. I think of it sort of as micro valleys of death. It's not just a single valley, but there's multiple pain points as somebody, as an entrepreneur, as a VC is trying to see some concept through that pathway and that progression from lab to market. And so I think that for us in TIP, and sort of what led to this establishment of TIP, was the confluence of everything that I've just described. This unique moment in time, this sort of changing landscape for discovery and innovation in this country and abroad. The sense that we really need to figure out how we can overcome that valley of death, and how we can bring industry and VCs and academia and government much more tightly together in a much more tightly coupled way, even more so than what we had been able to achieve up until that point. And I think at the end of the day, then, so that led to sort of the mission statement for TIP, if you will, which we sort of abide by in everything we do. Number one, we're trying to accelerate technology to the market. And number two, we have to recognize that to be able to do that well, it requires a workforce that's prepared to do that. And that workforce isn't just about PhD trained scientists and engineers. Yes, we need those folks, but we also need to think about, the full complement of the enterprise. So technicians, practitioners, educators, entrepreneurs, as well as the researchers. What's that ecosystem? What is the complement of skilled and trade workers to be able to support AI and quantum and some of the data centers and the like that are needing to be stood up, the fabs and for semiconductors that are needing to be stood up. So, how do we accelerate technology to the market? How do we think about the workforce and really training talent for the myriad job opportunities that we hope will come about into the future as a result of this inflection point with technology? And then I think the third thing that was the catalyst and part of our mission statement is the recognition that we can't do this sort of in isolated spots, right? So there's Silicon Valley and there's Kendall Square and there's Austin. There's a lot of great software hubs, or software driven hubs. There's a lot of great biomedical hubs in our country. But if we're thinking about critical minerals and materials, if we're thinking about energy and transitions around there, if we're thinking about food and agriculture, and how that shapes healthy living into the future. That's all across this country. And so to be able to realize this vision of American competitiveness on a global stage and sustaining that and enhancing that going forward in this era of intense competition, I mean, it's a national security argument at the end of the day, in my mind, to really be thinking about how do we seize upon the fullness of our geographic expanse. There's sort of secret sauces in different parts of a country that we
Mhm.
could elevate. And how do we seize upon the broad talent base that is America to be able to position us into the future? And so I think that's what was the catalyst for TIP. That's what got us to the establishment of this directorate. That's what sort of shaped the agenda in terms of programs and initiatives that we've tried to run. And that's, I think, what we continue to aspire to try to deliver on as we go forward.
Wow. Well, there's so much there. I mean, first off, that is a ton that you're focusing on. How many people work at TIP?
Yeah, so we have about anywhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 70 folks who are a part of our federal workforce. We also have some number of folks who at NSF, we call them rotators.
Mhm.
So they come to NSF for a period of time and then they go back to their home institutions. So they're oftentimes from academia. And so we have some number of those folks. And then we also have some AAAS fellows, harking back to
Nice.
when I was one. And we have some contractors who support our efforts as well. So it's a sizable group, and I think that part of what we set out to do with TIP when we started, though, is not just the numbers of people, but
Mhm.
the backgrounds of people, right? And so we're really interested in oftentimes I think NSF gets labeled as an agency that's tapping from academia and exclusively academia.
Mhm.
I think that in the case of TIP in particular, we've really sought to try to bring folks in who have a VC background. I had a chart one time that I was showing to colleagues. Not, I had to like obscure people's names because I didn't want to call anybody out individually. But thinking about sort of the backgrounds of folks, we've had folks who worked at DARPAs and ARPAs across the federal government. We've had folks who have come out of private industry. They've been the heads of research shops at industry at large multinational companies, right? Who are working with us. We have folks who come from state and local ecosystems where they're doing innovation and entrepreneurship and tech transfer and so forth. So we've really tried to, I think, assimilate a set of folks who are here for broadly, often a short period of time, but they come with these backgrounds. They sort of create this melting pot across these backgrounds to be able to help us see, okay, how do I think about some of the gaps in technology translation in specific technology areas like AI and quantum and wireless and biotech and so forth? And how do I plug those gaps? How do I design programs that will spur not just academics to come work with us, like NSF is known for, but to really bring industry to the table as well to help co-design, co-create potential directions that we might want to pursue, and also help uptake some of the outputs of the research and help get them translated and realized. And then how do we also think in parallel about the workforce and you know
Mhm.
um, I am the product of a training program, training grant that required me to spend some time in industry, even as a graduate student. I mean, that was eye-opening for me. It told me I didn't wanna go work in industry, no offense to my industry colleagues, but that in and of itself was insightful,
Yeah.
right? And I think that, that type of experience just helps us better prepare folks coming out of school so that they're ready for jobs on day one, as opposed to, you get to a job and then you have to spend the first 6 months with that practical experience. No, let's do that practical experience before you get there with apprenticeships and internships so that you can be better positioned. So, long story short, we have somewhere in the neighborhood of the numbers that I quoted, but it's really, I think, that range of expertise that's important for us as well.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I mean, as you mentioned, things are changing so rapidly and across all sectors. So makes complete sense that you need people from all those different sectors giving their input and having those in their mind. So some of these goals that you mentioned, changing who participates in innovation, strengthening regional ecosystems, those seem like things that might be kind of hard to measure. How do you think about evaluating success beyond traditional metrics for a tip?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Adeline. I mean, I think that historically, as far as the scientific enterprise is concerned, anyway, we often think about measures of success in the form of, okay, I'm going to do some. I mean, it's the scientific process, right? And so you have a hypothesis, you test the hypothesis, you run some experiments, you get some data, and you have an insight based off of that data. And so then the optimal approach tends to be you publish that work either in a journal or in a conference proceeding, depending upon the field, and maybe there's some insight that results that could lend itself to a patent disclosure or something to that effect. But oftentimes the focus is really on advancing the knowledge in the field, and so advancing
Mhm.
those papers and publications and so forth. And I think that what we're really trying to put a spotlight on here in TIP is to go beyond that, right? I'm not trying to devalue the emphasis on papers and publications and conference proceedings, but I do think that, especially if you think about more use inspired, use case driven research, which is where we start our endeavor here in TIP, to more translational work, we're thinking about, okay, what are the patents that we're filing? What are the new technological outputs that are resulting? What are the platform technologies that are emanating from the work that we're supporting? How does that turn itself into startups and small
Right.
businesses? What sort of mergers and acquisitions are taking place as sort of a follow on to the investment that we're providing? And how much follow-on funding are those investments yielding as a result of some of the de-risking work that we have done out of TIP, that we have funded out of TIP to position these technologies for that broader uptake, that broader consumption. Sometimes we have an effort around um, sort of bringing together coalitions of the willing in different parts of the country to leverage their backyard secret sauce, to think about growing an innovation economy within that community. So, for example, we funded researchers in Louisiana who are focused on thinking about energy for the future. Louisiana is home to 64% of all oil and gas that's flowing through our ports in this country in any given year, or some such number. It was 64% when I did this with them a few years ago. And so the thought process there is, well, if we're going to think about the future of energy, especially in the face of AI and data centers and so forth, you got to include Louisiana in that conversation. And so
Right.
we funded a regional innovation engine, as we call it down there, and the question there is, okay, how do we sort of leverage? How does sort of the investment by us at NSF and the federal government be a catalyst for the public-private composition of that team to really drive those use cases as the driving force behind the research agenda, to test out potential solutions in the same market spaces where the problems were identified? And how much then co-funding are we seeing? How much matching commitments are we seeing from the companies themselves, from the state itself, to be able to showcase that, yes, there is something here that we are interested in trying to draw out from this ecosystem. So those are the kinds of metrics. I mean, I'll give you two data points that I'm really excited by, for instance. So we invested about $135 million in nine what we call regional innovation engines distributed across the country, everything from energy to semiconductors in Florida, to thinking about agriculture, food and agriculture in North Dakota, to thinking about water security. Water security is a critical challenge these days, as well, in parts of the country. And so we've invested 135 million in 9 engines, and today, um, 21 months later, we have seen those engines accrue more than $1.5 billion in matching commitments from the private
Wow.
sector, from state and local governments, from VCs, et cetera. I mean, that to me is a mark of success, and that's the kind of measure we should be thinking about. In addition to the numbers of startups that have resulted, in addition to the number of talent that we've trained for a range of different jobs. Another data point that I'm excited about is one around SBIR. So we were the first agency with a small business innovation research program back in the day in the 1980s. Now many research funding agencies have SBIRs, but I'll just note that our SBIR program over the last several years, and that predates TIP, right? It predates the
Hmm.
establishment directorate, but it's now housed within TIP, and sort of has the same values in terms of our approach as the rest of the directorate. So the SBIR program over the last several years has invested, let's say, $1.5 billion in about 1,500 startups. That $1.5 billion has yielded more than $32 billion in follow-on investment from VCs, angel investors,
Wow.
private sector companies, and so forth. And this is the team that's made this happen. We have a tremendous talent base of former startup leaders, entrepreneurs, et cetera, right? Founders in their own rights, who are a part of our team. But I will talk about them and I will say, well, find me another program in the federal government with a 32 to 1.5 or 16 to 1, depending on how you count, return on investment in terms of follow-on investment that we're seeing. So I think that's the kind of thing that we're excited by, to measure, to assess, to be able to show that it's an indicator of progress that we're trying to result in.
Yeah, hugely exciting. Well, I also want to make sure that we get to another exciting new initiative from NSF, the Tech Labs initiative. Could you tell us a little bit about that and why it came to be?
Yeah, sure. So this is something that we launched in just the last few days. We're really excited about this, and we've been working very closely, in fact, with the administration and others on this concept. So really, I think part of this is to be able to, again. I'm going to start this from two places. I think one place is, as I mentioned earlier, we're really interested in trying to be able to see how do we potentially unlock technology and get it into the marketplace faster and more effectively. There are these gaps, there are these valleys, micro valleys, and so forth. And then I think the second part of this is so really trying to invest in technology translation efforts and pilots that allow us to be able to move technology from ideation to broad scale adoption, right? And then I think the second part of this is really thinking about, okay, we have lots of great talent in higher ed, but we also have great talent in industry, right? And we have great talent in various different settings and contexts. And in fact, it turns out that many of these have sort of their own institutional approaches, their own historic approaches, and so forth, to being able to support science, being able to support technology and the R&D innovation that's taking place. And so I think what we're trying to do. Not to take anything away from that ecosystem, but I think what we're trying to do is really expand our toolkit for how we invest in science, how we create more pathways to be able to, again, accelerate those ideas from lab into the marketplace and into the real world. And so our concept here is to be able to say, if we and by the way, I give full marks, full credit to folks who've come before us in this space. There've been these focused research organizations, FROs. We had a colleague from the Institute for Progress, IFP, who put out a concept paper around X Labs, it was called. Seed AI itself has put out some concept papers around this theme as well. But really about trying to say, okay, and by the way, at the same time as those papers have been coming out, I think there's also a growing sense that sometimes the frankly the federal financial assistance approach that we have relied upon, it can become burdensome. A lot of paperwork, a lot of folks having to write grant proposals, maybe even having to conduct a lot of preliminary research that goes into your grant proposal to get the next round of funding to be able to conduct preliminary research for the next round of funding that you might be able to get. And how do we acknowledge the fact that while we really care and deeply value high risk, high reward research endeavors, sometimes I think folks would say that there's a sense that sometimes the review process may not necessarily get at that as effectively as it could.
Yeah. I think, sorry, something that jumped out to me when I was reading the press release was that teams would get operational autonomy and milestone based funding. Do you think you could explain like what that means in practice and why it's so important to this
That's
initiative?
right. So I think the idea here is with tech labs is to be able to say, okay, rather than necessarily focus on the having to write research proposals and having to do all the things that I was just talking about, can we instead sort of fund these dedicated teams with multiple disciplinary expertise sets, with sort of a sense of okay, taking problems from the lab to the market. So, what are some of the technology acceleration and translation challenges that we face? And how do we sort of stitch that team together and have them be able to have the focused time and calibration and effort that's required to be able to really uh, address that specific problem and really be able to drive that problem or break through that barrier around that specific area of technology and that specific hurdle to technology translation. And then I think in terms of thinking about the ways in which we measure and assess progress, if you look at the RFI that we've put out, for instance, and I want to
Mhm.
stress, right, what we've put out is really intended to be sort of a starting point, right? We've put out a concept of how these could run. And we're looking for input from the community, from a broad base of the community to be able to tell us, okay, this sounds right. This doesn't sound right. Have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? How do we sort of use this as an opportunity to be able to then design an actual RFP, an actual funding opportunity that really allows us to be able to fund a set of tech labs? But at the end of the day, let's bet on a full-time team of scientists. Let's equip them with resources. Let's equip them with the flexibility to advance this sort of ambitious vision around a technical problem, around sort of potentially building a sector defining technology platform. And then let's focus on milestones that are really tailored around that, as opposed to how many papers have you published, how many conference proceedings have you been able to engender, and so forth. Let's instead focus on those outputs to really be able to shape the directionality potentially of an entire area of tech, an entire field that we're trying to move forward in a rapid fashion. I often give an example, and this may or may not be the best example, but an example of a Nobel Prize winning work that led to the CRISPR technology, for instance, right? So we have that work in the mid 2010s, um, and I think where the story could be further enhanced, further bootstrapped, is the fact that, okay, we have this discovery science that has led us to this technique. And yet now we're starting to see that being able to translate that into a wide set of market use cases and applications, we actually haven't necessarily been able to fully penetrate that to the extent that we would like or that we could. And yet we're seeing our competitors now being able to try to exploit this technology and use it in various ways. And so if we had had a tech lab, for instance, back then, that could really marshal together a team that focuses on, okay, what are the real world use cases? What are the barriers to getting across into those use cases? Can we have the focus time and not have to constantly write grant proposals? Can we think about outputs in the sense of, okay, what are those use cases that we're advancing? Now you start to potentially have the resources, the bandwidth, the autonomy from sort of the traditional institutional structures to really be able to drive that progress in a forward-looking way, really with that sort of singular mission focus, if you will, and not any of these other oftentimes distractions that come with being sort of um, a researcher or a researcher educator combination and so forth. So that's, I think, what we see as potential for this model,
Mhm.
and potential for really being able to sort of drive progress in certain key technology areas for the nation's competitiveness.
Yeah, it's really exciting to see all like the wide menu of options and different models that NSF is looking at for funding. I think it's something that is very refreshing and people will be excited to see. I want to leave you with one more question, maybe sort of a call to action, if you will. If you're a researcher, technologist, philanthropist, industry leader, someone who wants to contribute to building the next generation of US innovation, what would you say is the most important way that they could engage with NSF and TIP today?
Uh, so I think that my honest answer to that question, Adeline, is I think if you're any one of those folks that you just described, you probably have a preconceived notion of what NSF is or what NSF has been. You probably have a preconceived notion of how we support science and how we do the review process and so forth. And you probably have a preconceived notion of what we're looking for in terms of outputs over time and so forth. And I guess what I would say the best thing that you could do for us and for you and for the nation is to challenge those assumptions that you have going into the conversation, right? So rather than whatever that assumption might be willing to be open minded about the fact that, as you said just a moment ago, that we are trying to think about new ways of supporting science, right? That are complementary and sort of augment where we have been and what we have been doing and will continue to do. We are trying to bring in new sorts of performers or partners or stakeholders. So thinking about that broader expanse of the innovation enterprise, we want to see industry partnering on funding projects that we put out. We want to see the VC world engaging, and so I think that sort of broadening your horizon a little bit beyond what you've known NSF to be, to recognize that we're into the mode of experimentation, we're into the mode of new models, we're into the mode of really trying to engage a broader cross section of the ecosystem, and we're really interested in trying to be able to see how do we put our pulse on the bleeding edge and put our pulse also on at the same time accelerating technology to the market, which requires, I think, that market perspective from the start ingrained in some of the things that we're doing. So I would say challenge the assumption or your challenge your um, understanding of where NFSF is, what it has been, what it is trying to do, and let's figure out ways in which we can partner, figure out ways we can work together. Bring us ideas of new mechanisms, new approaches, and ways we can evaluate them so we can have some rigor in this approach so that, 5 years from now, for instance, we've tested out a few tech labs and we've had some real ground truth data that have shown to us that this model does work or this model doesn't work. And here are some adaptations that we could do going forward. I love there was an editorial when we put this out that said that this is an experiment and it might fail, but we will have learned something in the process. And I firmly believe that, right? That that's what we're trying to do here.
Right? That's what science is all about. Well, Erwin, thank you so much for joining, for your insights, and for all the really exciting work that you're doing at NSF. Can't wait to see where it all goes.
Well, thanks for having me, and I look forward to collaborating with some of your listeners as well.
You've been listening to Accelerate Science Now. I'm your host, Adeline DeYoung. This show is produced by Kindred Subjects, Accelerate Science Now, and Seed AI. Our executive producers are Josh New and Austin Carson. Special thanks to Kevin King for editing and production. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.